I have a podcast. I never thought I'd say that, but I'm saying it because this is a podcast. And it's a podcast that exists because I think it's necessary. As a federal employee, which I am, I can see what's going on with this government efficiency effort from a different perspective. And there are millions of people who work in the federal government who can also see this. And to this point, we've heard from them on various news outlets. We've heard their stories here and there, but there's not been a concise voice that's been given to them. And so that's what I hope to do with this podcast. By the way, when I was younger, it was kind of a cliche to be in a band. Everybody was in a band, it felt like. And now it's kind of a cliche to have a podcast. And I totally recognize that. And one of the things that's bothered me the most, and one of the main impetuses for starting this whole thing, is that there's a lot of talking points from left-leaning voices that try to couch this administration's actions as just stupid or nonsensical, dumb. These people in the administration don't know what they're doing. And every administration is going to have people in it that don't know what they're doing. But this administration in particular has a plan, and they're doing that plan. And to say that they're not doing that plan, to say that we don't know what they're attempting, is short-sighted. Because I think we all, whether you're on the right or the left, can understand better what is happening in the United States right now. I guess this is a pre-roll to the actual podcast. I don't know how these things are supposed to work. This is what it is. It's what it is. This is the podcast. There's music playing now. There'll be more talking in a minute. Anyway. Welcome to Doge Uncovered. I know what you're thinking. This is episode 1 of a podcast about Doge, and it's April. Elon Musk is talking about stepping down, or so we hear. And why are we still calling the podcast Doge Uncovered? I thought about that. Up until I published this episode, actually. I thought about changing the name of the podcast, but ultimately I decided that Doge is actually not going to go away. Doge is the tip of the spear, to use a military cliche, of a complete overhaul to the way Americans live and a complete change in the direction of the United States of America. And so I wanted to keep the title as Doge Uncovered. So this is episode 1. I never thought I'd be doing a podcast on government. It's one of the last things I had an interest in delving deep into. But then again, I never thought I'd be a government employee either. I knew the basics of how the federal government worked. And by basics, I mean I was an avid follower of news and politics. But seeing the world of government from the outside is very different from being on the inside. I can say unequivocally that there is a huge divide here between the public's understanding of how their government works and the gears that actually turn the wheels when it starts to move. Most of the federal government operates behind the scenes and in the shadows of Americans' daily lives. Most of my professional career, though, was not in government, and I only came to work as a federal employee fairly recently. This gives me a unique perspective on some of the frustrations and mind-numbingly complicated processes and procedures the federal workers encounter. And it's because of that, my life over the past years has taught me more than I ever thought I'd know about government. And I want to bring that information to folks who, like me, have existed on the outside of a full understanding for most of their lives. Anyone out there who wants to know more about how our government works or doesn't, here's your chance. I'm going to do this in a way that starts from the very beginning with a lens towards what is happening in government right now. I'm no expert, so I'll be relying on them should they be willing to lend their time to me. Join me as I go down the rabbit hole of policies the U.S. government has that affect you and me, even if we don't think they do. Let's learn about how our government works and why there are a bunch of disparate groups trying to dismantle it. By this point, if you're listening to this podcast, you probably know that Doge is Elon Musk's quasi-governmental agency, the Department of Government Efficiency. You've probably also heard that it was slipped into a rather unrelated pre-existing agency with an acronym they could continue using in official documents, that being the U.S. Digital Service. They just replaced the word digital with Doge. The government loves acronyms. Anyway, behind the facade of the government efficiency efforts led by the world's richest man exists a vast network of government departments with missions ranging from pollution mitigation, banking regulation, consumer and employee protection, foreign aid, veterans healthcare, food safety, and on and on. Most Americans think of government as what they learned in high school. There are three branches and they offer checks and balances on each other. While true, that isn't even a hyperbolic 30,000-foot view. It's more like a view from the moon. The inner workings of government are complex, and most Americans know little of how these systems work, or more importantly, why they are the way they are and how they got that way. When politicians come out and tell people things about waste, fraud, or abuse, they tend to listen. When politicians make promises and pass laws, people notice. But what they don't notice is what sort of gears start working under the hood when Congress does something. This podcast will tell the stories of government's complex engine, led by the now vilified federal workforce, and explain what exactly Doge is doing and why. What's happened already has been a wild shift from the normal functioning of government. To those not on the inside, this effort to root out fraud, waste, and abuse is sometimes seen as a shining achievement of Trump and Musk. And those who have worked in the federal service have stories from the inside. These folks are the silent class of American politics. People who just carry out marching orders and do the jobs assigned to them. This podcast delves into the history of federal employment, how the federal government became so large, how it actually works, and what Elon Musk and those around him actually want. Before we get into the nitty-gritty, we need to spend some time painting with broad strokes. And that is what the rest of this episode will do. Because we need Americans to understand why the federal workforce exists, how it came to be, how much it costs, and a bunch of other stuff. And these are things that most people don't think about. Some of these numbers can be so abstract when you hear about them in isolation, on the news or in the paper, whatever. But we're going to try to break that down. The federal government is the largest employer in the United States, and I believe it's also the largest employer in every single state within the United States. At its core, this is a large workforce that traditionally has not been subject to the whims of the rich or the changes in the market. This large workforce not only provides often invisible services to everyday Americans, but also acts as a buffer in economic downturns. The federal government employs about 2.2 million people as of late February 2025. Since 1945, the federal workforce has fluctuated between about 1.8 million and 3.4 million people. The height of 3.4 million was reached in 1990. The lowest employment level was just after World War II, when it fell precipitously from the wartime highs of about 3.2 million. Despite what you may have heard, the federal workforce has not grown. In fact, in per capita measurements, its size has significantly decreased. In 1945, the U.S. population was under 150 million. Today, it is 350 million. Despite that, the federal workforce has remained relatively constant in size. Despite being perceived as large in size, the salaries of the federal civilian employees comprise, on average, about 5% of the total budget of the U.S. government. Again, about 5% of the total budget of the U.S. government goes to pay the salaries and benefits of the employees who work for it. For comparison, the average Fortune 500 company spends between 40 and 70% of its annual operating budget on salaries. By this measure, when compared to the largest American companies who tout their efficiency to investors, the U.S. government is an incredibly efficient system. And if this information is new to you, or you are just now putting it into perspective, you may be asking yourself, what does Elon Musk and Doge expect to accomplish by significantly downsizing the federal workforce? It's a valid question for sure, and it will be the point of much of this going forward. For months before the election, and now since he's become president, Trump has vilified and denigrated federal employees. He constantly referred to the federal workforce as the administrative state and the deep state. We'll talk more about how this, quote, administrative state came to be, but first, let's look at the federal workforce. If federal salaries are 5% of the federal government's budget, where does the rest go? And who are the people who work for the federal government? Let's break down the departments first. All the numbers I'm about to give you are before any staffing reductions, and for clarity, we've been talking about the federal civilian employees in the executive branch, not military members or reserve personnel. Still, though, the Department of Defense is by far the largest employer of civilian staff in the federal government. With over 750,000 civilians working for them, the Department of Defense is so vast that it dwarfs nearly all other departments. And the next largest department is related to it, the Department of Veteran Affairs, which has about 400,000 employees. Next is the Department of Homeland Security, the Department of Justice, and the Department of the Treasury. These agencies hold well over half of all federal civilian employees. And the next 5 largest agencies make up more than another quarter. Department of Agriculture, Department of the Interior, Department of Health and Human Services, the Social Security Administration, and the Department of Transportation in that order. Moving down in size from there, we get to the smaller agencies and departments. Next, we come to things like the EPA, NASA, the General Services Administration, which is like the government's real estate broker, and the Department of Energy and Commerce. Because if I add to this list the State Department, the Small Business Administration, and the Department of Housing and Human Development, and the FDIC, I've pretty much mentioned every government department or agency with more than 5,000 employees. And it seems like the smaller the agencies are, the more we've heard about them from Musk and Trump as being wastes of money and evil. This begs a serious question. Musk, Trump, and the media love to hate on things like the Department of Education and USAID. We'll get back to this, but since I've mentioned USAID, I want to take a short sidetrack and talk for a moment about the education level of federal employees. As a whole, federal staff are better educated than the overall civilian workforce. A higher percentage of federal workers have bachelor's degrees than the general population, and more federal workers have master's degrees than the general population. If you had to guess which federal agency had the highest education level, you might say NASA. If I told you that was wrong, you might say, well, the National Science Foundation. If I told you that too was wrong, you may say the CDC. I would then tell you that that too is wrong, and you give up and ask me, well, what is it then? The answer is USAID. The U.S. Agency for International Development had the highest level of education of any federal agency. 2/3 of the 4,500 employees that USAID had held master's degrees, doctorate degrees, or other advanced degrees.
And it's gone.
And it was also small. The $32 billion budget is less than half of 1% of the entire federal budget. And $10 billion of that budget was for humanitarian aid, food aid. And much of that was grain purchased from U.S. farmers and given to countries around the world. The government was buying $2 billion worth of rice, lentils, peas, and wheat from American farmers. USAID, again less than half of 1% of the U.S. budget, was the largest provider of humanitarian aid in the world. USAID was set to engender goodwill around the world and to allow the U.S. influence in places we wanted influence in, and also to protect Americans from many of the issues that face poor countries. $6.3 million for men who have sex with men in South Africa? Yeah, that's so more AIDS doesn't come here, because people from South Africa, like Elon Musk, do come here. Vaccinating people? That's so diseases don't come here. If we're able to call diseases before they become widespread, we have a better chance of preventing these diseases from migrating to U.S. shores. And we get a lot of influence for relatively little money. Feeding people? You're welcome. Can we have your minerals now? You need a road? We'll give you a loan to build it. Can we put a military base here? If we aren't doing any of that, do you know who is more than willing to take our place? China, India. Closing down this program is one of the dumbest foreign policy decisions the U.S. could possibly make, especially when the U.S. is in the position it is in. Yet for months, we heard about how it was a waste of resources, how it was being fleeced, and money stolen by government employees, and all sorts of other stories about the agency. The media didn't listen to the educated experts, the foreign affairs specialists, the professors at universities, when they all tried to tell everyone that USAID was the best investment led by the smartest people in government that the U.S. could make on its own behalf to advocate for our interests around the world. So we ask, as I think you'll find we do repeatedly, what's going on here? Why was a relatively obscure agency with a low budget that takes its marching orders from the State Department the first to be defunded and closed? Was there even any fraud? So I just said that eliminating USAID was foolish, and what if it's not? What if it's foolish to all of the experts, all of the foreign relations personnel, all of the people that have dedicated their lives to supporting the system of government that we have now in the United States? But what if eliminating it is not foolish to the people who see something different? And I think here is where we get, if you've ever played the Zelda video games, here's where we get the first part of the Trump Triforce. This idea that the U.S. should not be in a position of power in the world, that the U.S. should not be doing these things in the world. We're going to talk a lot about the dollar and the value of the dollar in a little bit in future episodes, But I want to point this out right now. Getting rid of USAID was not a foolish mistake. It was not a dumb decision. It was a decision that was calculated, and it was based on a worldview that is completely foreign to most Americans, including those who support Trump's work. Let me get back on track. Remember, that was a sidetrack. When we mentioned that the salaries and benefits are about 5% of the federal budget, so where does the rest go? The federal government does a lot of stuff. There are over 660 specific occupations that OPM lists. OPM is the Office of Personnel Management. A lot of people think that OPM is like the HR department for the federal government, but it's not. Anyway, those 660 specific occupations are things that you'd never think of. And a lot of them are also things that the private sector has no interest in doing, things that contribute to our cultural heritage or our historical knowledge. Things that help us get a better understanding of the world around us, things that help us maintain our position as a world leader in research and development of technology and medicine. These are things that don't make money, but that are vital to promote the general welfare of the U.S. and its citizens. Now, though, we're being conditioned to see any of these things as DEI so that we can hate them. But the largest government expense is Social Security, which is funded by a trust fund that is funded by payroll deductions of American workers. So most of the time, the people drawing on Social Security are simply getting back what they put in. Medicare is the next biggest expense. It's $850 billion. That equates to 14% of the annual budget. Medicaid and other health programs are another 11%. That's $700 billion. Most of the time, we are fine with letting our representatives represent our interests. While this is often a huge mistake, it rarely has the implications that it has when they decide they want to cut benefits to regular Americans. I'll say this in the clearest way I can. Anyone who wants to significantly decrease the federal budget cannot do so without significantly cutting from one or more of these three programs. If they tell you they are going to shrink the government and at the same time they tell you they aren't going to raise taxes, cut defense spending, Medicaid, Medicare, or Social Security, then they are lying to you. And actually, I lied to you a little bit as well, because I told you that after Social Security, Medicare was the biggest expense that the government had. I guess technically it's not a lie because it is the biggest tangible expense. In other words, something is actually received for the cost, but nearly equal to the cost of Medicare is the cost of interest on the national debt. This is 14% and rising. It would be like losing 14% of your salary every month.
And it's gone.
Why is it then that Republicans and Democrats alike keep coming up with budgets year after year that raises the national debt limit, increases the debt, and increases the percentage of our government that goes towards this debt while giving tax cuts to the rich and cutting government services? To understand that, we first have to understand why they don't actually have an interest in cutting the federal deficit. That's right. For all the talk of bringing down the deficit, they don't actually have an interest in doing that. Because just like your credit card, someone is getting rich when you don't pay the balance down. There's a lot of talk about China owning U.S. debt, and while China does own some of the debt, they actually own less than you may think. The number one foreign owner of U.S. debt is actually Japan. China is right behind them. But all the foreign countries that own U.S. debt, it only makes up about a 22% ownership stake in these loans. Mutual funds, retirement funds, insurance companies, and U.S. banks hold nearly 60% of the government's debt. By holding this debt, they make money off of it. Massive interest payments to the tune of $870 billion worth of taxpayer money moves every year from the income column of the country's balance sheet to the expense column, lining the pockets of the biggest financial companies in the country. These companies also happen to donate massive amounts of money to political campaigns. The financial sector is the largest source of campaign contributions to federal candidates and political parties. There's no stomach among the political rulers in the U.S. to cut the U.S. national debt. And this same political ruling class has convinced Americans that all tax cuts are tax cuts for everyone, and that all tax increases are tax increases for everyone. So what is left? Budget cuts are the only way forward, and right now we see the government working on this exact thing. Without boring details about how much money or over how long a period of time, blah, 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 I'll just say that what the government is doing now will raise the national debt by trillions of dollars and give trillions of dollars of tax breaks to Americans. It will also necessitate massive cuts to government spending. And since there is no way to get the cuts they want by cutting staff levels or small programs, they will need to cut social programs that Americans rely on. The details of all of this are available elsewhere, so I don't want to go any further than that, but I wanted to simply couch this next part. Our representatives like to pretend that the federal deficit exists because government can't control spending. They like to say that the government that they manage is like a petulant child who can't stop spending on their parents' credit card. They like to pretend that they don't set the budget, that they don't set tax rates, that they don't set the governmental priorities, and they like to give themselves plausible deniability when it comes to what cuts get made. In the present day, this works by saying that they haven't cut Medicaid, but rather that they simply instructed the agency that oversees Medicaid to make cuts, claiming ignorance as to how they are going to make these cuts. But ignorance to which programs will be cut is bad, but this is something far worse. They've assigned the task of cutting programs to administrators, the administrators that they supposedly hate because they are all part of the administrative deep state. They've given agencies a budget that requires them to cut Medicaid. There's literally no other place to take the cuts from. And then, when those cuts get made, they'll try to blame someone else. I know that so far this inaugural episode has seemed somewhat unrelated to the experiences of federal employees, but I guarantee you that this is all necessary stage setting for what we'll get into. So at this point, I'm going to sign off because I think this has been about 20 minutes. I'm not sure. They say that that's how long your podcast episode is supposed to be. But anyway, it's a good stopping point for what I have to talk about next. So please, if you want to reach out, if you have something to say, if you have feedback, if you're a federal employee with a unique perspective, give me an email. The email address is dogeuncovered@protonmail.com. Thanks again for listening. I hope you'll come back next time and check out the podcast. The topic next week or whenever is going to be Donald Trump's favorite president and his infamous tariffs.